The golden California light streamed through the trees, casting dappled shadows across the expansive patio. A man stood hose in hand, his sleeves rolled up and weathered arms glistening with water droplets. A toddler's laughter filled the air, pure and unrestrained, as he splashed in a wide plastic tub. For a moment, everything was perfect, until a voice cut through the scene like a steel blade. "You're bathing my son like a stray dog." The words hung in the air. Colton Hayes froze mid-motion, his calloused hands still gripping the garden hose. Water droplets caught the sunlight as they cascaded over the dark curls of the laughing toddler. For a second, everything stood still. The water, the breeze, even the boy's giggles, suspended in the sudden silence. Clarissa Dane stood at the edge of the marble path, her designer heels digging slightly into the soft grout between stones. Her tailored black pantsuit remained crisp despite the rush that had brought her here. Steel cold eyes fixed on the scene before her as if it represented a personal betrayal. The toolbox felt heavier today. Colton Hayes adjusted his grip as he walked along the curved driveway of the Dane estate, his work boots crunching against the perfectly maintained gravel. Morning sunlight filtered through the row of cypress trees, casting long shadows across his path like the bars of a cage. 38 years old, and here he was carrying tools instead of blueprints. The irony wasn't lost on him. Once he had designed structures that changed skylines. Now he fixed leaky faucets and troublesome sprinkler systems in a house that cost more than everything he'd ever owned combined. Life had a way of redrawing your plans without permission. Colton reached the maintenance shed, a structure more elegant than most people's homes, and set down his toolbox. The metal hit the wooden workbench with a satisfying thud. He pulled out the work order for the day, irrigation system troubleshooting in the East Garden. Straightforward enough. The kind of problem with clear solutions, unlike the ones that kept him awake at night. "Mr. Hayes." He turned to find Mrs. Garcia, the housekeeper, standing in the doorway. Her normally calm face showed signs of worry. "The nanny called in sick. Ms. Dane is stuck in meetings all day. Connor is with me, but—" She hesitated. "I can't watch him and finish preparing for tonight's event." Colton nodded slowly. He understood the unasked question. This wasn't the first time the staff had turned to him when the toddler was involved. Something about the way he handled the boy had earned their trust, though he never sought it. "I'll keep an eye on him while I work," he said simply. Relief washed over Mrs. Garcia's face. "Thank you. He's in the sunroom. I've set up his toys." Colton gathered his tools and made his way to the house. The main residence of the Dane estate stood like a modernist's dream. All clean lines, vast windows, and unforgiving angles. Beautiful but cold like its owner. In the sunroom, Connor sat surrounded by expensive educational toys, most untouched. The 2-year-old looked up as Colton entered, his small face brightening instantly. Colton, the boy's attempt at his name, brought an involuntary smile to Colton's face. "Hey, buddy." He crouched down to the child's level. "Want to help me fix some pipes today?" Connor nodded enthusiastically, already abandoning his designated activities. Colton knew he should probably keep the boy with his approved toys and structured play, but something in him rebelled against the rigid schedule posted on the refrigerator in Ms. Dane's precise handwriting: 10:00 a.m. Educational play, 11:00 a.m. Language development activities. A child should get dirty sometimes, should laugh without it being scheduled. Colton led Connor outside, keeping him close as they moved toward the East Garden. The irrigation system there had been acting up. Uneven water distribution, pressure problems. Nothing he couldn't handle. He'd designed water management systems for entire communities in his previous life. This was just plumbing with plants. As he worked, he kept Connor engaged, explaining what he was doing in simple terms. The boy watched with fascination as Colton disassembled a sprinkler, head cleared a blockage, and reassembled it. "See this?" Colton held up a small rock he'd extracted. This little guy was stopping all that water. Sometimes the smallest things cause the biggest problems. Connor reached for the pebble and Colton placed it carefully in his small palm. The boy examined it with the serious concentration only toddlers can muster, then grinned. "Fix it," Connor declared proudly. "That's right, we fixed it." They moved through the garden methodically, Colton checking each section. Connor helped by handing him tools, often the wrong ones, but Colton never corrected him. Instead, he'd say, "Good thinking, but let's try this one instead," turning each moment into a lesson without making it feel like one. By midday, Connor's designer clothes were smudged with dirt, his hands grimy from helping. The boy couldn't have been happier. Colton knew he should probably clean him up before lunch, but the joy on the child's face was worth whatever reprimand might come. As they finished the irrigation check, Connor spotted a butterfly and took off running after it, his small legs pumping furiously across the manicured lawn. Colton followed, keeping a watchful eye. The boy's laughter echoed across the grounds, a sound too rarely heard in this perfect, sterile mansion. The butterfly led them to a patch of mud near the recently watered rose garden. Before Colton could intervene, Connor had stepped right into the middle of it, his expensive shoes sinking into the brown muck with a satisfying squelch. "Uh-oh," Colton said, trying to sound stern, but failing to hide his amusement. Connor looked up, his face a mixture of concern and delight. Then, seeing no anger in Colton's expression, he jumped again, sending spatters of mud onto his pressed shorts. "Mud," he announced triumphantly. Colton sighed, knowing he'd now have to clean the boy up before anyone saw. "Yeah, buddy, that's definitely mud." He lifted Connor out of the puddle, but the damage was done. The child was filthy from the knees down, his designer outfit ruined. Mrs. Garcia would have a fit. Ms. Dane would probably have him fired. "Let's get you cleaned up before lunch," Colton said, carrying the muddy boy toward the patio. He remembered seeing a garden hose there and a large plastic tub used for plant transportation. It would have to do. He set Connor down on the stone patio and went to work, engineer's mind already solving the problem. He found the plastic tub, rinsed it thoroughly, then filled it with a few inches of water from the hose. He tested the temperature with his wrist, sun-warmed and perfect. "All right, little man, water time." Connor's eyes widened with delight. "Water time? Water time," Colton confirmed, helping the boy remove his muddy shoes and socks. Connor looked hesitant for a moment, then asked in a small voice, "Mommy says no mess." Something twisted in Colton's chest. "Sometimes mess is okay," he said gently, "especially when we clean it up after." That was all the permission Connor needed. With Colton's help, he stepped into the makeshift bath, giggling as the water splashed around his legs. Colton carefully rinsed the mud from the boy's legs and feet, using the hose with precision. Connor's laughter grew as the water tickled his skin. Soon the simple cleanup had turned into joyful play, with Colton creating gentle sprays of water that made rainbows in the sunlight, while Connor tried to catch them. "Daddy did water," Connor said suddenly, his small hands splashing. Colton's movement slowed. "Your daddy gave you baths outside," Connor nodded enthusiastically, "with hose and bubbles." "That sounds nice," Colton said softly, filing away this rare mention of Connor's father. Ms. Dane never spoke of him, and the staff knew better than to mention him. "No more daddy," Connor continued, his voice matter-of-fact, in the way only children can manage when discussing life-altering events. "No more water time. Mommy doesn't like mess." Colton's heart ached. He recognized in Connor the same loss he'd seen in his own son's eyes. Not just the absence of a parent, but the absence of joy that had gone with them. "Well," Colton said, creating another gentle spray of water that made Connor squeal with delight. "Today, we have water time." He didn't hear the car arrive, didn't notice the quick footsteps approaching, until that voice sliced through the air like a scalpel. "You're bathing my son like a stray dog." Colton froze, the hose still running in his hand. Slowly he turned to face Clarissa Dane. She stood like a statue carved from ice, perfect, beautiful, and utterly cold. Her platinum blonde hair was pulled back in a severe style that accentuated her sharp cheekbones and penetrating blue eyes. Not a single wrinkle marred her black pantsuit, despite the fact she'd clearly rushed home. The voice cracked through the warm California air like a whip. Colton Hayes froze mid-motion, the garden hose still running in his hand. Droplets sparkled in the sunlight as they streamed gently over the dark curls of the laughing toddler, splashing in the wide plastic tub on the patio. For a second, everything held still. Clarissa Dane stood at the edge of the marble path, stilettos digging slightly into the soft grout, her perfectly tailored black pantsuit rumpled from rushing. Her eyes, cold steel under designer sunglasses, were fixed on the scene as if it had personally betrayed her. Colton turned slowly, placing the hose down beside him with deliberate care. His uniform shirt was half-wet, sleeves rolled up, arms dusted with light freckles and dried water. He didn't speak yet. Neither did Connor, who blinked up at the woman frozen in the doorway. The smile on the boy's face didn't disappear. It just paused like a film stopped mid-frame. "I asked you a question," Clarissa said again, sharper this time. Colton stood to his full height, calm, quiet, unreadable. Years of presenting designs to demanding clients had taught him to mask his emotions. He got muddy, he said simply. He was playing and you thought the proper response was to drag him outside and spray him down like... She threw up a hand, her voice cracking with fury. Like this, Connor splashed a hand unaware, sending a wave of water onto Colton's pants. Colton didn't even glance down. I didn't drag him anywhere, he replied evenly. He asked, said he wanted water time. He laughed, Ms. Dane, he laughed. Clarissa's lips tightened into a thin line. My son was scheduled for music therapy at 3, structured I 4. I came home to find him half naked in a plastic bin while my janitor plays summer camp. The word janitor landed like a slap. Colton's jaw tensed, but his voice stayed level. You came home early. Clarissa took a step forward, her heels clacking on the wet tile. That is not the point. No, Colton said, meeting her gaze directly, but it might be the problem. Her eyes flashed. Excuse me? Colton finally broke the eye contact and crouched beside Connor again. The boy reached up, tiny fingers wrapping around one of Colton's shirt buttons. You know what he said when I filled this tub? Colton asked softly, not looking up. He said, Daddy used to fill water here? Then he said, no more water time. Mommy doesn't like mess. Clarissa flinched just slightly, a crack in her perfect facade. Colton stood again. I didn't plan it. I didn't break rules on purpose. The upstairs water was off for pipe maintenance. He was already muddy. I figured the sun was out, the hose was near, and the boy wanted to laugh. Clarissa looked down at her son. Connor smiled, lifting his soaked plastic dinosaur that had somehow made its way into the bath. Roar, the boy whispered, offering it up like a peace offering. It didn't help. Mr. Hayes, she said coolly, you were hired to maintain the grounds, not parent my child. Colton felt heat rise in his chest but kept his voice steady. And yet, he said, eyes steady, you left him with me. The silence was sharp. She hated that it cut as deep as it did. Colton reached for a towel nearby, wrapping Connor up with practiced ease. The boy leaned into him like it was the most natural thing in the world. Clarissa didn't miss that. She also didn't understand why it bothered her so much. You're dismissed for the day, she said, voice brittle. I'll have HR follow up. I'm not on contract, he replied, just day-to-day hire. You want me gone? Say the word. He paused, then added quietly, but maybe ask your son first. She opened her mouth, but no words came. Instead, Connor turned to her still damp towel draped like a cape and said softly, happy. Clarissa blinked. What? The boy pointed at Colton. We happy. And the words dropped like stones into the well of her chest. Colton didn't gloat. He didn't smile. He simply nodded and handed Connor to the waiting nanny who had appeared silently at the back door. Then, without waiting for permission, he gathered his tools, slung the cleaning cart into motion, and walked away. Each step slow, deliberate, echoing like punctuation marks on everything she didn't want to admit. Clarissa stood there long after the tiles had stopped dripping, and she wasn't sure what she hated more, the mess on the patio or the way her son looked at the janitor like he was the safest place in the world. I want a full background check on him. Tonight. Clarissa Dane didn't raise her voice, but her tone could have sliced glass. Chloe, her executive assistant of nearly a decade, blinked from across the sun-drenched kitchen island. You mean the maintenance man? Clarissa looked up from her untouched espresso. Yes, the maintenance man. The marble countertops gleamed under the morning light, everything pristine except the inside of her chest, which felt like it had been cracked open since the incident on the patio. Chloe nodded hesitantly, tapping something into her tablet. Just to confirm, Colton Hayes. He's only been here 6 weeks. Exactly. And in 6 weeks, my son says more to him than to his own mother. Chloe paused, then said quietly, That's not entirely a bad thing, Clarissa. Clarissa shot her a look. Chloe raised her hands in surrender. Just saying, some people have a way with children. As Clarissa stood abruptly pushing the espresso aside like it had betrayed her, I need to know who he is, before I let him put another drop of water on my child. 2 hours later, Chloe returned. Clarissa was in her home office staring at blueprints for a new development. She wasn't really reading them, her mind still replaying the image of Connor's face lighting up when he'd spotted Colton. Here it is, Chloe said, placing a file gently on the desk. Colton Hayes, 38, former structural engineer. Worked for Montrose and Klein, top firm in Seattle. Designed award-winning eco-housing for low-income communities. Married. Wife passed away in childbirth 3 years ago. One son, no criminal record, no legal issues. Clean as snow. Clarissa flipped through the pages. Photo certificates, a newspaper clipping with a headline. Young engineer wins National Humanitarian Award for Sustainable Housing Project. She looked up. Why is he a maintenance man? Chloe shrugged. He walked away from it all after his wife died, took custody of his son, relocated to LA, started working odd jobs. She hesitated. I guess floors are quieter than grief. Clarissa swallowed hard. The image of Colton's calm eyes, the way he'd wrapped Connor in a towel, came back with a sharpness she didn't expect. He's too involved, she muttered. Chloe frowned. Too involved. Clarissa stood again, walking to the window overlooking the yard. Connor is attaching to him. It's not healthy. I don't need someone who plays parent. I need someone who does their job. But isn't that the point? Chloe asked carefully. He is doing his job. You just didn't know which one your son needed most. Clarissa turned. You're speaking out of line. Chloe didn't flinch. No, I'm speaking as someone who watched a little boy cry himself to sleep for weeks because someone else left. That landed like a slap. Clarissa's spine stiffened. I want him gone by end of day, she said coldly. Make sure he understands it's not personal. Chloe didn't argue, but her silence said enough. Colton didn't seem surprised when Chloe found him in the garage hours later. He was kneeling beside an antique motorcycle, carefully cleaning chrome that already gleamed. Another thing being fixed that wasn't broken. He wiped his hands on a rag, glanced once at the envelope she handed him, then simply said, I figured. No one's angry, Chloe offered. It's just, Clarissa prefers more structure. Colton nodded once slow. She runs her life like a blueprint. I'm a stain she can't scrub out. Chloe smiled softly. Maybe you're more like a misdrawn line, the kind that changes the whole design for the better. He looked at her, the first flicker of gratitude in his tired eyes. Tell her, he said quietly, Connor never cried with me, but he always missed her. That night, Clarissa walked past Connor's room and heard nothing. No giggles, no murmured stories, no sound of Colton's low voice narrating dinosaur battles or bedtime truck noises. Just silence. She peeked in. The boy lay awake, eyes open, staring at the ceiling. Connor, she said gently. He didn't turn. She crossed the room, sat on the edge of his bed. Sweetheart, it's time to sleep. Still nothing. Would you like your book? No answer. She placed her hand on his small back. It was warm, unmoving. Then in a voice barely louder than a whisper, he asked, Did Daddy Colton go away? Clarissa's breath caught. What? Water, Dad? Connor whispered. Did he leave because I laughed too loud? It hit her like a truck. She wanted to say no. She wanted to say, of course not. But the truth tangled somewhere between her throat and her pride. He just had to go home, honey, she said finally. Connor blinked slowly. I don't like home when he's not here. And then like a curtain falling on her composure, Clarissa turned off the light and stepped out, her heart pounding in her ears. She walked straight to her office, pulled out her phone and stared at Colton's number in Chloe's report. But she didn't call. She was Clarissa Dane, CEO philanthropist woman who rose from a bankrupt father's legacy and rebuilt it into an empire. She didn't call maintenance men in the middle of the night because her son couldn't sleep. Instead, she did what she knew best. She made a list. Interview new childminder. Reinstate structured play. Reinforce boundaries. Eliminate unnecessary emotional variables. Her hand paused. The last line stared back at her like a quiet accusation. Eliminate unnecessary emotional variables. She scratched it out, wrote instead, understand what Connor needs, not what looks good on paper. She dropped the pen, folded the paper, and for the first time in years, Clarissa Dane cried quietly alone. No press, no board meeting, no perfection, just the sound of a mother who realized maybe she wasn't parenting. She was performing, and the audience had just stopped clapping. Clarissa stood by the nursery door, arms crossed, lips tight. On the other side of the glass, Connor was wailing. Not tantrum, wailing, not hungry wailing. This was the kind of cry that curled deep into the marrow of her bones. Jagged, breathless sobs of a child who didn't understand why the world had shifted. Is this normal? Clarissa asked without turning. The nanny, a woman with a pristine resume and colder eyes than steel, gave a stiff nod. He's just overstimulated. He'll calm down once he understands who's in charge. Clarissa's jaw tightened. The tub in the adjacent bathroom stood full. Warm water, rubber ducks, lavender-scented soap, everything appropriate. Yet Connor was standing near it, fists clenched, body shaking like he'd been cornered by something invisible. Try again, the nanny said flatly, reaching for the boy's wrist. Connor shrieked. Stop, Clarissa said louder than she meant to. Let him be. The nanny froze, glancing back. Ma'am, if we give in, we set a precedent. Clarissa stepped forward, lowering herself to Connor's level. Hey, she whispered. It's okay. Connor turned face, blotchy nose, running eyes red. No water, no water, no water. But you love water, she said gently. You love baths. Connor shook his head fiercely. Not with her. Clarissa paused. Why not? He looked up at her, lip quivering. Because she doesn't laugh. 3 words. That was all it took to split something inside her wide open. Clarissa stood up slowly. You're dismissed for today. The nanny blinked. Excuse me? I'll pay your full rate, but please leave. There was tension, long and pregnant, but the woman finally obeyed. When the door clicked shut behind her, the room exhaled. Clarissa sat beside the tub, unsure of what came next. Her fingers fidgeted on her lap. Connor sniffled quietly in the corner, arms wrapped around his small knees. She looked over, tried to smile. You want me to read you something? He shook his head. I could put on your music. Still no. The silence thickened like fog over glass until suddenly Clarissa stood up, walked over to the tub, and did something she hadn't done since college. She rolled up her silk sleeves, dipped her manicured hand into the water, and splashed. Connor looked up, startled. Clarissa looked at him, eyes wide with mock seriousness. Did you hear that? Connor blinked. I think, she whispered, there's a water monster in here, a very naughty one. She splashed again, this time louder. Connor's lip twitched. Clarissa splashed once more, accidentally soaking her blouse. She gasped dramatically. He got me, Connor. Help, only you can stop him. There was a long beat, then a giggle. Small, fragile, but real. And then Connor crawled slowly toward the tub. He dipped a finger in, then a hand, and then a foot, then splash. Water erupted everywhere, soaking Clarissa head to toe. Her expensive shirt clung to her ribs. Her blowout was ruined, but all she could do was laugh. Really laugh. Connor was now standing in the tub, stomping with glee. Got him, he shouted. You did, she said, breathless. And for the first time in a long time, Clarissa Dane, titan of glass towers and billion-dollar decisions, sat cross-legged on a tiled floor, soaked and smiling, because her son had finally laughed without someone else's presence to coax it out. But deep down, she knew. She hadn't won. She'd only remembered. Later that night, Clarissa dried Connor off herself. Pajamas, brushed hair, a small bruise on his shin, she kissed without thinking. She sat by his bed, flipping through one of his books. But Connor, already snuggled into his covers, stared out the window. Quiet. Mommy, he asked softly. Yes, baby. He looked up at her. Can we go find Daddy Colton? Colton, Clarissa's heart twisted. He had to go back to his home, sweetie. Connor's eyes drooped. He said home is where people wait for you. Clarissa didn't speak. Connor yawned. But I'm waiting here. She turned off the light with trembling fingers, sat alone on the hallway floor for longer than she'd ever admit, her soaked blouse still in the laundry, her heart even wetter. The next morning, she walked into the kitchen and found Chloe pouring coffee. Clarissa sat down wordlessly. Chloe raised a brow. You look like someone who got ambushed by a rogue water monster. Clarissa cracked a tired smile. He laughed, she whispered. He actually laughed with me. Chloe sat down the pot. That's amazing. Clarissa nodded, then added, but he still asked for Colton. Chloe watched her carefully. Do you want him back? Clarissa didn't answer right away. I want to believe I'm enough, she said. But the truth is, Colton doesn't try to be perfect. He just shows up. Chloe smiled softly. Maybe that's what makes him perfect. Clarissa looked up, her voice quieter than a breath. Chloe, what if I've built my entire life on a blueprint that never made space for laughter? Chloe leaned in. Then maybe it's time to draw a new one. Clarissa let that sit in her chest. Heavy, real, but not crushing. Just true. That night, when Clarissa tucked Connor into bed, he said something that stayed with her long after the lights went out. I like you messy, Mommy. She froze. You're funny when you splash, he added. Clarissa bent down, kissed his forehead. Good night, baby. She closed the door and leaned against it. Heart cracked, yes, but maybe cracks were how the light got in. The attic smelled like cedar and silence. Clarissa hadn't stepped into the space in years. Dust floated like lazy snowflakes through a shaft of late afternoon light, slicing across the floorboards. Boxes labeled in Chloe's precise handwriting lined the shelves. Financials 2020, press kits, legal, Selena's things. The last one drawing her eye with a pang. But she wasn't here for her mother today. She reached for a faded blue banker's box marked Staff Temporary, 1099 Archive, dragging it to the floor. Her fingers trembled slightly as she peeled the lid off. Inside, amidst payroll copies and old onboarding forms, was what she was really after. Colton Hayes, a small file, neat, simple. Clarissa sank onto the floor, cross-legged in linen slacks, and opened it. A resume typed in blocky font, bachelor's in civil engineering, master's from Stanford, letters of recommendation from CEOs, nonprofit directors, even a former mayor. Then taped to the inside flap, a crumpled clipping from the Seattle Times. Engineer Colton Hayes wins National Humanitarian Award for Green Community Design. The photo showed him in a collared shirt, younger, clean-shaven, holding a small girl on his hip, while smiling into a sea of camera flashes. She wasn't his daughter. The caption said she was from the project's pilot shelter, but the way he held her, Clarissa touched the edge of the paper, tracing the faint crease between them. Why? Why had a man with that kind of pedigree ended up fixing sprinklers in her estate? She found the answer beneath the article in a worn manila envelope tucked behind the resume. Blueprints, hand-drawn, smudged with age. She unfolded the first. A community center shaped like a semicircle. Trees in the courtyard, benches curving like open arms. Classrooms, reading nooks, rainwater harvesting tanks. Children's play areas designed with sandwater and textures. No plastic, just earth. At the bottom in pencil, if we build like children deserve to be happy, the world might finally listen. Clarissa stared at the words as if they'd spoken aloud. Another sheet, folded and faded, was marked Dream Draft Only. This one was more personal. It bore the same sweeping style but was sketched into the shape of a house. Not big but open. One master room, one child's room, a central kitchen flooded with natural light, a porch wrapped around the front, and a line written just beneath the title box, For Laya, for who we would have become. Clarissa felt her breath leave her body in one long, slow exhale. This wasn't a maintenance man. This was a man who'd once designed futures. That night, Clarissa sat at the kitchen table long after Connor had gone to sleep. The blueprints were spread before her, anchored at the corners by salt shakers in a toy dinosaur. A half-drunk glass of wine caught reflections from the overhead lights. Chloe walked in, barefoot, tie loosened from a long day. Wow, she said, stopping. You went digging. Clarissa didn't look up. He used to build hope. Literally to him. Chloe pulled out a chair and sat. What happened? His wife died, Clarissa said softly, in childbirth. He walked away from everything after that, moved here with a baby boy and a broken heart. Chloe nodded, eyes dropping to the blueprints. And you hired him to maintain the grounds. Clarissa flinched. Don't. I'm not judging, Chloe said gently. I'm just seeing the full picture now. Clarissa ran a finger over one of the plan lines. He drew homes like they were meant to breathe. Bite, Chloe sipped from her tea, then offered, maybe the reason Connor trusts him isn't just because he plays dinosaurs. Maybe it's because Colton sees children the way architects see buildings, full of potential and worth protecting. Clarissa blinked hard. Do you think he hates me? She asked. Chloe gave her a look. No, but I think he pities you. Clarissa sat back, stung. Chloe didn't soften. You're brilliant, but you manage motherhood like it's a quarterly report. Efficient, flawless, emotionally bankrupt. Silence stretched. Finally, Clarissa whispered, I don't know how to be anything else. Chloe leaned in. Then maybe it's time someone taught you. The next day, Clarissa pulled into a quiet neighborhood on the edge of town. Tree-lined, faded fences, yards full of real life, garden hoses, forgotten toys, chalk drawings on driveways. She checked the address again, then stepped out of the car. Colton's house was a small bungalow with cracked steps and wind chimes that whispered instead of rang. She knocked. Footsteps, then the door opened. Colton stood there in a gray t-shirt and jeans, a dish towel in hand. His eyes flicked in surprise. "Ms. Dane," he said flatly. Clarissa swallowed. I wanted to talk." He stepped aside. "You came all this way." "I found your plans," she said. "The house, the shelter, the community circle." Colton didn't move. "Beautiful," she added. "Thank you," he said simply. "I didn't know about Leia or your work or what you gave up." Colton folded the towel slowly, then placed it on the arm of the couch. "I wasn't hiding it," he said. "I just wasn't offering." Clarissa stepped closer. "Why maintenance? Why my house?" He looked up at her. "Because the only place my son heard another child laugh was your backyard." That landed like thunder. Colton continued quieter now. "I took the job to pay bills. I stayed because Connor found someone to echo with. You were building silence around him. I couldn't let him forget what joy sounded like." Clarissa's voice broke. "You think I'm a bad mother?" "I think you're scared," he said, "of noise, of losing control, of getting it wrong." She blinked, fighting back a wave. "I was just trying to protect him." Colton nodded. "Then start by protecting what matters. Not the schedule, not the image, just his heart." A long pause, then Clarissa's voice shaking. "Would you ever finish the project, the one for the kids?" Colton looked away. "I don't know." "What if I helped?" He turned to her. Really turned this time. "And why would you want to build something like that?" Clarissa's answer came from a place she hadn't known still existed. "Because for the first time, I'm starting to realize I've built a life that no one wants to live inside." Colton studied her face, looking for cracks in her sincerity. Finding none, he nodded once. "I'll think about it." Clarissa handed him a business card. Not her standard corporate one with embossed lettering and the company logo. A plain white card with just her personal number. "When you decide," she said. The man who built dreams took the card with calloused fingers. When he repeated neither a question nor a promise, just a word hanging between them like the first support beam of something not yet built. Clarissa turned to leave, then paused at the door. "I fired the nanny." Colton's eyebrows rose slightly. "She doesn't laugh," Clarissa explained, echoing her son's words. And for the first time since they'd met, Colton Hayes smiled at her. A real smile that reached his eyes and lifted decades of grief from his face. "Tomorrow," he said, "East Garden, 9 o'clock. There's an irrigation system that still needs fixing." It wasn't forgiveness, it wasn't absolution, but it was a foundation. "We'll be there," Clarissa said. As she walked back to her car, the wind chimes on Colton's porch sang a little louder. Like applause, but gentler. The kind you give not for performance, but for courage. Morning arrived with the gentle persistence of California sunshine filtering through the oak trees that lined the east garden of the Dane estate. Dew still clung to the manicured grass, glistening like scattered diamonds in the early light. Colton Hayes arrived 10 minutes early, his truck's tires crunching on the gravel driveway like footsteps on fresh snow. He sat for a moment, hands resting on the steering wheel. His weathered fingers traced the cracks in the leather covering, lines like the ones etched into his own palms after years of building and designing, creating, then destroying, then rebuilding again. Life was a series of renovations, some by choice, some by force. He gathered his tools, the familiar weight of the box, a comfort in his calloused hands. The estate looked different in the morning light, less imposing, more vulnerable, like seeing someone without their makeup for the first time. Colton made his way to the east garden, setting his tools down near the malfunctioning irrigation controls. He crouched, examining the system with practiced eyes, mentally mapping the network of pipes and wires that lay beneath the pristine lawn. Problems were easier when they lived underground. You could dig them up, face them directly, fix them. The sound of voices made him look up. Clarissa was walking across the lawn, her usual business attire replaced by dark jeans and a simple white button-down. Her hair was pulled back in a loose ponytail rather than her severe corporate style. Connor trotted beside her, occasionally jumping to catch her hand, which she gave him without hesitation. Something about the sight made Colton's chest tighten. The boy looked happy, not the frantic, desperate happiness of their water play, but a quieter contentment, as if some essential piece of his world had been restored to its proper place. "Good morning, Mr. Hayes," Clarissa called as they approached, her voice still carrying that precise boardroom quality despite her casual appearance. "Morning," he replied simply, "and it's just Colton." Connor broke away from his mother and ran the last few yards. "Colton," he squealed, launching himself toward the man. Colton caught him with practiced ease, steadying the boy as he examined the toolbox with wide-eyed fascination. "Hey, buddy, want to help fix some pipes today?" "Yes," Connor bounced with excitement. "Fix it." Clarissa approached more slowly, her designer sneakers, probably worth more than Colton's monthly rent, pristine against the damp grass. "I hope we're not interrupting your work." "He's never an interruption," Colton said, nodding toward Connor, who was already digging through the tools with delighted concentration. "And you're the boss, so you can't interrupt either." A small smile flickered across Clarissa's face. "About that, I wanted to discuss something with you." Colton straightened his expression, carefully neutral. Years of client meetings had taught him to prepare for anything. Budget cuts, design changes, complete project overhauls. "I'm listening." Clarissa glanced at Connor, then back to Colton. "I've been reviewing some of Dane Development's current projects. We have a community housing initiative breaking ground in East Los Angeles next month." Colton nodded, keeping his face impassive despite the unexpected topic. "The design is functional," she continued, "but after seeing your blueprints, I realize it lacks vision." She paused, her fingers playing with the edge of her sleeve, a small tell of nervousness he wouldn't have expected from her. "I'd like you to consult on the project. Review the plans, suggest improvements, if you're willing." Colton studied her face, looking for the angle, the hidden agenda. Corporate types always had one. "You have a team of architects on payroll. Why me?" "Because they design buildings," she said simply. "You design homes." The distinction wasn't lost on him. It was precisely the philosophy that had driven his career before everything fell apart. Before Leia. "I'm not licensed in California," he said, defaulting to practicalities. "As a consultant, you wouldn't need to be. Our team would implement your suggestions. Full credit, of course, and appropriate compensation." Connor tugged at Colton's pant leg, holding up a wrench almost as long as his arm. This one, Colton crouched down, temporarily turning away from Clarissa. "Good eye, but we need a smaller one for this job. See this one?" He selected a more appropriate tool. "This fits the special screws." Connor nodded seriously, taking the wrench as if receiving a sacred artifact. When Colton stood again, he found Clarissa watching them with an expression he couldn't quite read, something between curiosity and longing. "Why now?" he asked her directly. She didn't pretend to misunderstand. "Because I saw what you built before, and I think my company, these families, would benefit from that vision." She hesitated. "And because my son trusts you. That's not a small thing in my world." The morning breeze rustled through the garden, carrying the scent of roses and damp earth. Somewhere nearby, a mockingbird trilled, a complicated melody of borrowed songs stitched together into something new. "One condition," Colton said finally. "I work from here, not your office, and I set my own hours." Understanding dawned in her eyes. "Your son," he nodded once. "Jason's in preschool part-time. I structure my work around his schedule." "Agreed," she said without hesitation. "I'll have the plans delivered this afternoon." Colton extended his hand, a gesture as much about establishing boundaries as sealing their agreement. "Then we have a deal, Miss Dane." She took his hand. Her grip was firmer than he expected, her skin softer than his by decades of different choices. "Clarissa," she corrected. Their handshake lasted perhaps a moment longer than strictly necessary, an acknowledgement of something shifting between them. Not quite trust, but the foundation being laid for it. Connor broke the moment, tugging at both their hands. "Fix pipes now." They both smiled, their expressions mirroring each other in a way neither noticed, but anyone watching would have seen immediately. "Yes," Colton said, ruffling the boy's hair. "Let's fix the pipes." The Dane Development Project plans arrived that afternoon, delivered by courier to Colton's modest bungalow in a sleek black portfolio embossed with the company's silver logo. The contrast between the luxury item and his worn coffee table was almost comical. Colton opened it after Jason was asleep, spreading the drawings across the living room floor. The plans were technically perfect. Every measurement precise, every code requirement met, every detail accounted for. But Clarissa had been right. They lacked soul. The proposed community housing looked like what it was: a cost-efficient solution to a problem. Not a place where lives would unfold, where children would grow, where families would build memories. Colton found a roll of tracing paper in his old drafting supplies, pulled out his pencils, unused for years but still sharp, as if waiting for this moment. His hand hovered over the blank sheet, trembling slightly. 3 years since he'd designed anything more complicated than a treehouse for Jason. The weight of it all, Leia's absence, his abandoned career, the path not taken, pressed down on his shoulders like a physical force. But then he thought of Connor's laughter during their water play, of the families who would live in these buildings, of the chance to build something that mattered again. He set pencil to paper, and the trembling stopped. Clarissa Dane had built her career on predictability and control. Board meetings, investment strategies, development timelines, all of it followed patterns she had mastered. But standing on her own patio at 7 in the morning, watching Colton Hayes spread revised blueprints across her outdoor dining table, she found herself in unfamiliar territory. He worked with a quiet intensity that commanded attention, his movements efficient as he arranged the drawings. Connor sat nearby on a cushion, meticulously coloring a simplified version of the plans Colton had prepared specifically for him. "Your architects aren't wrong," Colton began without preamble, pointing to the original designs. "These will function. People could live here. But that's the problem. They're designed for people. Abstract concepts. Not for Maria with 3 kids and a night shift job who needs a safe place for them to play while she sleeps. Not for the elderly couple who want to grow tomatoes but can't bend down anymore." Clarissa stepped closer, studying the overlays he had created. "You've completely reconfigured the common spaces." "I created community spaces," he corrected. "There's a difference. Common spaces are areas people share. Community spaces are where they connect." He traced a finger along one modification, a curved courtyard where the original had shown a simple rectangular green space. "See how this creates natural gathering spots, but also pockets of privacy. The shape itself guides interaction without forcing it." Clarissa leaned in her shoulder, nearly touching his as she examined the design. "You've added gardens on the rooftops. Urban agriculture provides food, reduces heating costs, gives residents ownership of something growing." His finger moved to another section. "And I've redesigned the playground to be intergenerational. Areas where grandparents can sit comfortably while still engaging with children, not just watching from a distance." "The construction costs would increase," she noted, but her tone was thoughtful, not dismissive. "By about 12%, he acknowledged, "but utility costs would decrease by nearly 20% over 10 years. The materials I've specified are more expensive initially but require less maintenance and have longer lifespans." She raised an eyebrow. "You calculated the ROI." A small smile touched his lips. "I was a project lead before I was a maintenance man. Numbers were part of the job." She studied him for a moment, seeing past the work clothes to the professional he had once been. Still was beneath the surface. "These modifications are exceptional. They're necessary," he said simply. "If you're building homes, not just housing." Connor chose that moment to scramble over, proudly holding up his colored version of the plans. "Look, I made it pretty." Clarissa crouched down to his level, accepting the drawing with appropriate reverence. "It's beautiful, sweetheart. What's this part?" She pointed to a green scribble in one corner. "That's where the dogs play," Connor explained seriously. "Every home needs dogs." Colton chuckled. "Can't argue with that logic." Clarissa looked from her son to Colton, then back to the professional blueprints with their precise measurements and technical notations. Something shifted in her expression, a softening around the eyes, a decision forming. "I want to present this to the board," she said, straightening up. "The full redesign. Your vision." Colton's expression turned guarded. "I'm not looking to return to corporate life. Not asking you to. This would be a one-time consultation presentation. But they need to hear it from you. The why behind these changes, not just the what." She held his gaze. "These families deserve an advocate who understands what makes a house into a home. The morning sun had risen higher, casting long shadows across the plans, like reaching fingers connecting the separate buildings into one cohesive vision. When, he asked finally. Thursday, 10 a.m. Colton glanced down at Connor, who had returned to his coloring tongue poking out in concentration. I'll need to bring Jason. His preschool is closed that day. Clarissa didn't hesitate. Connor would love the company. Our childcare center at headquarters is excellent. The offer hung between them, practical on the surface, but layered with deeper meaning. Trust. Their children the most precious parts of their broken worlds together while they built something new. Thursday then, Colton agreed. Connor looked up, sensing the significance of the moment, though not understanding it. We're gonna build something big. Colton ruffled the boy's hair gently. Yeah, buddy, something big. The Dane Development headquarters occupied the top 10 floors of a gleaming skyscraper in downtown Los Angeles. Glass and steel stretched toward the clouds, reflecting the blue California sky like a mirror. Beautiful, pristine, and utterly cold. Exactly like its owner had been when Colton first met her. He felt out of place the moment he stepped through the revolving doors, Jason's small hand clutched in his. His son gazed up at the soaring atrium with wide-eyed wonder while Colton fought the urge to turn around and leave. Dad, it's like a spaceship, Jason whispered, his voice echoing slightly in the vast lobby. Colton squeezed his hand. Sure is, buddy. He had made concessions to the environment, trading his work clothes for dark jeans, a crisp button-down, and the one blazer he still owned from his previous life. It fit differently now. His shoulders had broadened from physical labor, his frame carrying muscle where there had once been the softer build of an office worker. Clarissa was waiting by the security desk, Connor at her side. She wore a tailored charcoal suit that probably cost more than Colton's monthly mortgage, but something about her seemed different, more approachable. The severe hairstyle of their first meeting had been replaced by something softer, framing her face rather than disciplining it. Connor spotted them, first tugging at his mother's hand and pointing. Jason's here. The boys had met once before during a planning session at Clarissa's home. They had taken to each other immediately despite, or perhaps because of, their different backgrounds. Both children of single parents. Both carrying losses they were too young to fully understand. Good morning, Clarissa said, stepping forward to meet them. Her eyes took in Colton's appearance with a quick, professional assessment that nevertheless made him feel suddenly self-conscious. Thank you for coming. Thank you for the opportunity, he replied formally, then relaxed slightly as he crouched down to Connor's level. Hey there, buddy. How's that dinosaur doing? Connor beamed. He's at home. Mommy says no dinosaurs at work. That's probably wise, Colton agreed seriously. Dinosaurs in boardrooms can be very distracting. Clarissa's lips twitched, suppressing a smile. The child care center is on the 3rd floor. I thought we might drop the boys off together before heading up to the conference room. They moved through security with the efficiency that marked everything in Clarissa's world. In the elevator, the boys chattered excitedly while the adults maintained a professional silence that wasn't quite comfortable but wasn't uncomfortable either. The child care center was a revelation, bright, airy, filled with natural materials and thoughtful design elements. Not at all what Colton had expected from a corporate facility. You designed this, he said. Not a question, but a realization as he recognized certain elements. The reading nooks, shaped like tree houses, the natural light maximization, the careful balance of open space and cozy corners. Clarissa nodded, a hint of pride in her voice. One of my first projects after taking over the company. Most of the board thought it was an unnecessary expense. But you knew better. I knew what I wanted for Connor, she corrected. The business case came afterward. They watched as the boys were welcomed by the staff and immediately drawn into an ongoing building project involving wooden blocks and fabric canopies. Neither child looked back as their parents slipped away. In the elevator ascending to the executive floor, Clarissa turned to Colton. Nervous? He considered deflecting, then decided on honesty. It's been a while since I presented to a board, and I've never presented to one where I used to fix their plumbing. She actually smiled at that, a genuine expression that transformed her face. If it helps, Mr. Grayson in finance still doesn't know you're the same person who unclogged his executive bathroom last month. Colton chuckled, the tension in his shoulders easing slightly. Small mercies. The elevator doors opened directly into a reception area clad in muted grays and blues. A sleek desk curved like a wave behind which sat Chloe, who greeted them with a warm smile. "They're ready for you," she said, rising to escort them to the conference room. She leaned in slightly as they walked, adding in a lower voice, "I may have mentioned your Stanford degree and Seattle portfolio when distributing the meeting materials, just so they're properly contextualized." Colton shot her a grateful look as they approached a set of frosted glass doors. The boardroom beyond was exactly what he expected. Long table leather chairs, wall of windows, showcasing the city below. 8 men and 2 women in expensive suits turned to regard them as they entered. Their expressions ranged from polite interest to barely concealed skepticism. Clarissa moved to the head of the table with the practiced ease of someone who belonged there. "Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for accommodating this special session. As you know, our East Los Angeles Community Development Project breaks ground next month. After reviewing the current plans, I've brought in a consultant with expertise in sustainable community design to propose some modifications. This is Colton Hayes." Colton stepped forward, setting his portfolio on the table. The leather was worn at the edges, a relic from his previous career that had spent years in a closet. He unzipped it slowly, the familiar action centering him. "Mr. Hayes was the lead designer on the award-winning Greenbridge project in Seattle," Clarissa continued. "His approach to community-centered architecture has been recognized by the Urban Development Institute and the American Association of Sustainable Design." One of the men, silver-haired with the well-fed look of someone who made decisions over expensive lunches, leaned forward. "Hayes, weren't you with Montrose and Klein?" "Yes, sir," Colton replied, meeting his gaze steadily. "For 8 years. Thomas Montrose is an old friend, spoke highly of you." The man frowned slightly. "Lost track of you after that project in Colombia." "Life took a different turn," Colton said simply, unwilling to elaborate in this setting. Clarissa smoothly redirected the conversation. "Mr. Hayes has reviewed our current plans and proposed modifications that I believe warrant serious consideration." Colton. He took a deep breath and began spreading the drawings across the table. This was familiar territory. For all that had changed in his life, this hadn't. The ability to read a room, to speak the language of possibility contained within lines on paper, to make others see what could exist instead of what was expedient. "Your current design meets all code requirements and budget parameters," he began. "It's efficient, functional, but it fails to address the actual needs of the community it's meant to serve." A woman with a sharp bob and sharper eyes and narrowed her gaze. "The community's need is affordable housing. That's what we're providing." "People need more than shelter," Colton countered, his voice steady. "They need places to connect, to grow, to build something lasting. Your current design treats residents as units to be housed, not as families trying to build lives." He walked them through his modifications. The curved spaces that naturally fostered interaction, the gardens that provided both food and dignity, the flexible community areas that could adapt as needs changed. The construction costs would increase by 12% initially, he acknowledged, addressing the concern before it could be raised. But operational costs decreased by 20% over a 10-year period due to energy efficiency improvements and reduced maintenance needs. The silver-haired man, introduced as Harrison Bentley, the board chairman, tapped a manicured finger on the rooftop garden design. "Liability issues with roof access. Addressed in Section 4 of the proposal," Colton replied. "The structural modifications include safety features that exceed code requirements while actually reducing insurance premiums through our partnership with Urban Green Initiatives." For 40 minutes he fielded questions, some genuine, some clearly designed to poke holes in his vision. Through it all, he remained steady, grounded in the certainty that came from having actually built things with his hands, not just designed them on paper. Clarissa remained silent throughout, but he could feel her watching. Not just the board's reactions, but his as well. Evaluating, calculating, strategizing. Finally, Bentley leaned back in his chair. "Impressive modifications, Mr. Hayes, but why should Dane Development take on the additional upfront costs when the standard design would sell just as quickly in his current market?" Before Colton could answer, Clarissa spoke. "Because we're not just selling units, Harrison. We're building a community that will carry our name. These modifications reflect the values this company was founded on, that my father established and that I intend to strengthen." Her voice held a quiet authority that Colton hadn't heard before. Not the brittle command she'd used when they first met, but something deeper, more authentic. More practically, she continued, these design elements would differentiate our properties in a crowded market, justifying a 7% premium on the market rate units while still maintaining affordability for the subsidized portion. The press coverage alone from the sustainability features would reduce our marketing costs by an estimated 15%. She nodded to Colton. But the most compelling reason is the one Mr. Hayes began with. These aren't just buildings, they're homes. And Dane Development has always understood the difference. A silence fell over the room. Colton realized he was holding his breath and consciously released it, the sound barely audible in the quiet. Bentley studied Clarissa for a long moment, then turned to Colton. You designed the Green Bridge Projects Community Center. Yes, sir. My daughter lives near there, takes her kids to the playground. Says it's the only one where the parents actually talk to each other instead of staring at their phones. He tapped the blueprints thoughtfully. That's not something you can put in an ROI spreadsheet. He looked around the table, then back to Clarissa. I moved to approve the modified design contingent on Mr. Hayes' continued involvement through the construction phase to ensure these intangibles are properly executed. Clarissa's expression revealed nothing, but Colton caught the slight tightening of her fingers on her pen. This wasn't part of their agreement. Mr. Hayes is currently engaged in other projects, she began carefully. Then perhaps we should return to the original design, Bentley countered. The value here isn't just in the drawings, Ms. Dane, but it's in the vision behind them, and vision requires oversight. Colton felt the moment balancing on a knife's edge. He had come here for a one-time consultation, not to be pulled back into the corporate world he deliberately left behind. Yet something in him responded to the challenge, the opportunity to see these plans become reality, to build something meaningful again. I could consult on a limited basis, he offered, surprising himself as much as Clarissa. Site visits, review meetings, implementation guidance. But I maintain my current work schedule and location. Clarissa studied him, clearly trying to read his intentions. He met her gaze steadily, letting her see that this was his choice, not something she needed to protect him from. She turned back to the board. I believe we can accommodate that arrangement, assuming the compensation package reflects the value Mr. Hayes brings to the project. The vote was unanimous. As the board members filed out, several stopped to shake Colton's hand, their earlier skepticism replaced with professional respect. One even asked for his card, which he didn't have, another remnant of his former life left behind. When they were finally alone in the boardroom, Clarissa turned to him. You didn't have to agree to that. I know. He began gathering the blueprints, carefully returning them to his portfolio. Why did you? He paused, considering the question. Because drawings are just possibilities. Buildings are realities. He looked up at her. And I've spent too long away from building real things. Something shifted in her expression, a recognition perhaps of the shared experience of returning to abandoned parts of oneself. Thank you, she said simply. He nodded once, acknowledging not just her thanks but the understanding beneath it. We should get the boys, he said, zipping the portfolio closed with finality. As they walked to the elevator, their steps fell into an easy rhythm, matched without conscious effort. Neither mentioned it, but both noticed. This unexpected synchronicity between a CEO and a maintenance man, between two broken people, carrying their pasts in different but equally heavy ways. The project moved forward with surprising speed. Clarissa had always run her company efficiently, but Colton observed a new energy in the teams assigned to the East LA development. His modifications had sparked something, not just among the architects and engineers, but throughout the organization. People wanted to be part of building something meaningful. Twice a week, Colton visited the construction site, Jason often in tow. The boy loved watching the massive machines transform the empty lot into the beginnings of buildings, his eyes wide with the same wonder Colton remembered feeling on his first job sites. Clarissa joined them, occasionally bringing Connor. The boys had become fast friends, their different backgrounds irrelevant in the face of shared interests, dinosaurs, construction equipment, and the inexhaustible energy of childhood. On one such visit, nearly 2 months after the board presentation, they stood at the edge of what would become the central courtyard. The curved foundations were taking shape, the first hint of Colton's vision emerging from the earth. Mr. Santiago wants to discuss the rooftop garden irrigation, Clarissa said, consulting in her tablet. Always working, always moving forward. He's concerned about the water pressure calculations. Colton nodded, watching as the boys crouched nearby, examining something in the dirt with intense concentration. Tell him I'll call this afternoon. It's a valid concern, but there's a simple fix. You always say that, she noted, a hint of amusement in her voice. Simple fix, as if everything can be solved by looking at it the right way. Not everything, he said quietly, but more than people think. She followed his gaze to the boys. They're good together. They are. He hesitated, then added, Jason asks about Connor on the days we don't see you. Something softened in her expression. Connor does the same. The admission hung between them, not just about their sons, but about the four of them, this strange unit they had formed without intending to. A construction worker approached, hard hat in hand, interrupting the moment. Mr. Hayes, we've got a situation with the Eastern Foundation. The soil composition isn't matching the survey reports. Colton nodded. I'll take a look. He turned to Clarissa. Can you watch Jason for a few minutes? Of course, she hesitated, then added, actually, why don't I take the boys to get lunch? There's a good taco place just down the street. You can join us when you are done. It was such a simple offer, but it represented something significant. Clarissa Dane's CEO offering to take their children for tacos while he solved a construction problem. Roles reversed, boundaries blurring. They'd like that, he said simply. He watched as she gathered the boys, her movements more relaxed than he'd ever seen them. Connor took her left hand, Jason her right, and they headed toward the site exit, the CEO and two small boys stepping carefully around construction equipment. Colton turned back to the problem at hand, but part of him remained with that retreating trio. This unexpected connection that had grown from a chance encounter with a hose and a plastic tub. They're beautiful, Clarissa said softly. They stood in Colton's modest living room, studying the framed blueprints that hung on the wall, his award-winning designs from before. He had invited her to dinner after a particularly productive site meeting, a spontaneous gesture that surprised them both. More surprising was her immediate acceptance. The boys were in Jason's room building an elaborate fort under the supervision of Mrs. Rodriguez, Colton's elderly neighbor, who often helped with childcare. They were good projects, Colton acknowledged, handing her a glass of wine. Nothing expensive, he didn't know enough about wine to fake sophistication, but a decent red that paired well with the pasta sauce simmering on the stove. Why did you stop? She asked, turning to face him. After Laya, I mean. I understand as stepping back, but you walked away completely. Colton took a sip of his own wine, buying time. He rarely spoke about this, even to friends. But something about Clarissa's direct question deserved an honest answer. I designed our house, he said finally, the one we were going to live in after Jason was born. Spent months getting every detail perfect. The way the morning light would hit the nursery, the kitchen layout that accommodated her cooking habits, the reading nook by the back window where she liked to grade papers. He moved to the window, looking out at his small backyard where a simple swing set stood. We bought the land, had the foundation poured, then she went into labor early and... His voice trailed off. I'm sorry, Clarissa said quietly. He nodded once, acknowledging her sympathy without turning. Afterward, I couldn't bear to look at blueprints. Every line, every measurement reminded me of what should have been, of the future I designed that would never exist. The pasta timer dinged, breaking the heavy silence. Colton moved to the kitchen, grateful for the distraction. Clarissa followed, leaning against the counter as he drained the pasta. What changed? She asked. Why agree to work on our project? He focused on the task at hand, steam rising around his face as he poured the pasta into a colander. Honestly, Connor, she blinked, surprised. My son, the day with the water tub. Colton stirred the sauce, the rich aroma of tomatoes and herbs filling the small kitchen. Seeing his joy in something so simple, it reminded me why I became an architect in the first place, to create spaces where life happens, where joy is possible. He looked up, meeting her gaze directly. Your son laughed that day like my wife used to laugh when she saw something beautiful, full-bodied, unrestrained, like the world was good and right just for that moment. Clarissa's eyes glistened slightly. She looked down, composing herself. I don't think I've ever laughed like that. Maybe you haven't found the right spaces yet, he said gently. She looked up, something vulnerable and questioning in her expression. The moment stretched between them, filled with unspoken possibilities. Then Jason's voice called from down the hall. Dad Connor broke the fort, and the moment dissolved. Dinner was simple but good. The boys chattered about their architectural disaster and subsequent rebuilding efforts. Clarissa complimented the food with genuine appreciation. They talked about the project, about the boys' schools, about ordinary things that felt extraordinary in this context. A CEO and a maintenance man sharing a meal, their sons becoming friends, their worlds intersecting in ways neither had anticipated. After the boys were settled with a movie, Clarissa helped Colton clear the dishes despite his protests. I'm not completely helpless, you know, she said, deftly stacking plates. I did live alone before Connor. I never said you were helpless, he countered, running water into the sink. Just not used to cleaning up after spaghetti dinners in someone else's kitchen. First time for everything. She handed him a plate, their fingers brushing briefly. Thank you for tonight. It's been nice. Nice, he repeated with a small smile. High praise from Clarissa Dane. She rolled her eyes but returned the smile. I'm trying to say I've enjoyed this, being here, the four of us. So have I, he admitted. They worked in companionable silence for a few minutes, falling into an easy rhythm. Then Clarissa spoke again, her voice careful. The board is pleased with the project progress. They've asked about future developments, whether you'd consider consulting on other properties. Colton's hands stilled in the soapy water. I told you I'm not looking to return to corporate life. It wouldn't be corporate exactly, more like selective projects, ones that matter. He turned to face her, leaning against the sink. What's really happening here, Clarissa? She set down the towel she'd been holding. Her movements precise. The company is launching a new division focused on community-centered development, affordable housing, mixed-use spaces, sustainable design, everything you have been advocating for. The board wants you to lead it. The offer hung in the air between them, unexpected and unwanted, and yet somehow inevitable. The past reaching forward to reclaim him. No, he said simply, you haven't heard the terms. It's not about the money. His voice remained calm but firm. I left that world for a reason. It cost me too much the first time. This would be different. You'd have a complete creative control, flexible hours. Why is this so important to you? He interrupted, studying her face. Why push for this? She hesitated, then answered with unexpected honesty. Because you're wasted fixing sprinklers, Colton. Because I've seen what you can build when given the chance. And because, she stopped abruptly. Because what? Clarissa looked away, her professional facade cracking slightly. Because I'm selfish. Because having you around has made things better. For the project, for Connor. For me. The admission clearly cost her. Clarissa Dane didn't reveal vulnerability, didn't acknowledge need. Her world was built on projecting strength and control. Colton felt something shift inside him. A door long closed, creaking open just slightly. I can't go back to that life, he said more gently now. But I'll think about a middle path. Something that preserves what matters to me while still building something worthwhile. Relief flickered across her face. That's all I'm asking. From the living room came the sound of childish laughter, Connor and Jason reacting to something in their movie. The simple joy of it filled the small house, wrapping around the complicated adults in the kitchen like a promise. They're good together, Clarissa said again, echoing her words from the construction site. Colton nodded, hearing the unspoken question beneath her observation. Yes, he agreed. They are. The storm arrived without warning, dark clouds gathering over Los Angeles with unusual speed. By mid-afternoon, rain lashed the construction site in angry sheets, forcing the workers to secure equipment and retreat. The weather forecast predicted 3 days of heavy downpours, a rare occurrence in Southern California, where rain typically fell in gentle, manageable amounts. Colton received the call from the site manager just after picking Jason up from preschool. Flooding in the eastern section erosion concerns potential foundation damage if the drainage systems failed. I need to check the site, he told his son, as they changed course heading toward East LA instead of home. It's an emergency. Jason nodded solemnly from his car seat, understanding in his 4-year-old way that his father's work mattered. Will the buildings be okay, Dad? That's what we're going to make sure of, buddy. The site was a mess when they arrived. Mud everywhere, temporary barriers failing, water pooling in areas meant to be protected. Colton left Jason with the site office manager and waded out into the storm rain, soaking through his jacket within minutes. He moved methodically through the site, assessing damage, directing workers, implementing emergency measures to protect the most vulnerable sections. His boots sank ankle-deep in mud, but his mind was clear-focused. This was the kind of problem he understood. Tangible, urgent, solvable, with the right approach and enough determination. He didn't hear Clarissa arrive. Didn't notice her presence until she appeared beside him at the Eastern Foundation, her designer raincoat plastered to her slim frame, blonde hair darkened and dripping under a hard hat. "What are you doing here?" he shouted over the downpour. "Santiago called me," she shouted back. "Said you might need executive authorization for emergency measures." A crack of thunder emphasized her words, followed by a flash of lightning that illuminated the site in stark white light. "You should be inside," he said, gesturing toward the office. "Connor is with Chloe at headquarters," she finished. "What do you need?" He studied her for a moment. Clarissa Dane's CEO standing in mud that had probably ruined $1,000 shoes, refusing to retreat to comfort while he worked in the storm. "We need sandbags on the north perimeter," he said finally, "and pumps for the eastern section. The drainage system is overwhelmed." She nodded once, already pulling out her phone. "I'll make the calls." For the next 2 hours they worked side by side. Colton directing the physical efforts, Clarissa handling logistics, obtaining equipment, cutting through red tape with the efficiency of someone used to making things happen, regardless of obstacles. The rain continued relentlessly, but the immediate crisis began to abate as their measures took effect. By sunset, the site was secure, the foundations protected, the worst of the damage contained. They stood together at the edge of what would become the community courtyard, surveying their work. Both were soaked to the skin, mud-splattered, exhausted. But something else lingered beneath the fatigue. A shared satisfaction, the quiet pride of facing a challenge together and overcoming it. "Thank you," Colton said simply. "You didn't have to come out here." "Yes, I did." She pushed wet hair from her face, leaving a smudge of mud across her cheek. "This matters to me, too." The rain had gentled, somewhat, falling now in a steady rhythm rather than angry sheets. In the fading light, with her corporate polish literally washed away, Clarissa looked different, more real, more human. Beautiful in a way he hadn't allowed himself to notice before. "We should get the boys," she said after a moment. "It's getting late." Colton nodded, suddenly aware of how close they were standing, how the shared experience had broken down something between them. Jason's probably talked the office manager's ear off by now. They turned toward the site office, walking shoulder to shoulder through the mud. Something had shifted between them, some barrier washed away by the storm and their joint effort to protect what they were building together. Neither mentioned it, neither needed to. Like the foundations they'd just saved, some things were understood without words. The changes came gradually after that. Small adjustments that seemed insignificant in isolation, but together formed a pattern neither of them acknowledged directly. Clarissa began joining Colton for site visits more frequently, not just for formal inspections, but casual check-ins, bringing Connor along to play with Jason while they reviewed progress. Sometimes they'd get lunch afterward, nothing fancy, just tacos or sandwiches at nearby places where the boys could be themselves without worrying about proper restaurant behavior. Colton found himself at the Dane estate more often, initially for consultation meetings, then for impromptu dinners when the discussions ran long. He taught Connor how to plant tomatoes in a small garden patch they created together. Clarissa watched from the patio, work emails temporarily forgotten, as her son learned to nurture something growing. They never discussed these changes, never defined the boundaries of this new arrangement. It existed in a space between professional collaboration and personal connection, neither fully one nor the other, until the day everything changed. It began normally enough. Colton was at the construction site early, reviewing the installation of the custom playground equipment he'd designed. The project was nearing completion, 3 months of intensive work transforming his blueprints into physical reality. The community spaces were taking shape, the garden beds installed, the curved walkways paved. His phone rang, Chloe's number flashing on the screen. Unusual but not alarming. "Hello, Colton?" Her voice was tight, controlled in a way that immediately put him on alert. "There's been an accident. Connor collapsed at school. They've taken him to Cedar Sinai." The world tilted slightly. "What happened?" They don't know yet. Clarissa's on her way there now. She asked me to call you. The fact that Clarissa had thought of him in this moment, that she wanted him to know, registered dimly through his rising concern. Tell her I'm on my way. And Chloe, call my neighbor, Mrs. Rodriguez. Ask her to pick up Jason from preschool. He was already moving as he ended the call, shouting instructions to the site manager, keys in hand, heart pounding against his ribs like it wanted to escape. The hospital corridors seemed endless, branching and merging in confusing patterns, despite the color-coded lines on the floor meant to guide visitors. Colton followed the blue line to pediatrics, his mind racing with possibilities, each worse than the last. He found Clarissa in a private waiting area, standing by the window. Her back was to him, shoulders rigid with tension. She turned at the sound of his footsteps, and the look on her face stopped him cold. Fear, raw and undisguised. Clarissa Dane, who faced down boardrooms and billion-dollar negotiations without blinking, was terrified. What happened? He asked, crossing to her immediately. They don't know. Her voice was strained higher than normal. He was in music class, just fell over, didn't respond when they tried to wake him. Her hands were trembling. They're running tests. They mentioned his heart, his brain. They're looking for... She couldn't finish. Without thinking, Colton took her hands in his. They were ice cold despite the warmth of the room. He's going to be okay, he said firmly. Connor's strong. You don't know that, she whispered. You can't promise that. No, he admitted, but I'm here anyway, whatever happens. Something in her expression cracked, the last defense against vulnerability giving way. She stepped forward, and Colton opened his arms, enfolding her against his chest as her body shook with silent sobs. They stood like that for long minutes, Clarissa Dane drawing strength from the maintenance man who had once fixed her sprinklers. The irony wasn't lost on either of them, but it didn't matter. Nothing mattered except the small boy behind those hospital doors and the fear they now shared. When she finally stepped back, composing herself with visible effort, Colton kept one hand on her arm, a point of contact and anchor in the storm. I called Jason's school, she said, wiping her eyes. Asked them to let him stay late. Chloe's arranging for someone to pick him up if we're here a while. Mrs. Rodriguez is getting him, Colton confirmed, but thank you for thinking of him. She nodded once, the simple acknowledgement carrying more weight than elaborate words could have. A doctor appeared at the doorway, young, serious clipboard in hand. Ms. Dane, Clarissa straightened immediately, corporate mask sliding back into place. Yes, how is my son? We've completed the initial tests. Connor experienced what we call a vasovagal syncope, essentially a complex fainting spell. His heart rate dropped suddenly, causing temporary loss of consciousness. What caused it? Clarissa demanded. Often these episodes are triggered by stress, dehydration, or sometimes an underlying arrhythmia. We're still running tests to determine if there's a cardiac component. But he'll be all right, Colton asked the question Clarissa seemed afraid to voice. The doctor's expression softened slightly. He's stable and conscious, asking for his mother. And he glanced at his notes. Someone named Colton said he fixes things. Clarissa's hand found Colton's, gripping it tightly. That's us, she said. Can we see him? Immediate family only at this stage? The doctor began looking at Colton questioningly. He's family, Clarissa said firmly before Colton could step back. Connor needs him. The doctor hesitated only briefly, then nodded. Follow me. Connor looked impossibly small in the hospital bed wires, connecting him to monitoring equipment, an IV in his tiny arm. His face brightened when he saw them, though his usual energy was notably absent. Mommy, Colton. He tried to sit up, setting off one of the monitors. Easy, buddy, Colton said, moving to the bedside. Those machines don't like quick movements. Clarissa was already on the other side, smoothing Connor's hair back from his forehead, her touch gentle but trembling slightly. How are you feeling, sweetheart? Tired, and my arm hurts. He pouted at the IV. They poked me. I know, but it's helping you feel better. Connor looked at Colton hopefully. Can you fix it? Make it not hurt. The simple faith in the question, the absolute certainty that Colton could fix anything, squeezed his heart like a fist. Not this time, buddy. The doctors have to do this fixing. But I'll stay right here while they work. Okay. Connor nodded, satisfied with this compromise. Will you tell me a story about building things? Colton pulled a chair close to the bed, settling in. How about I tell you about the biggest bridge I ever helped design? It went all the way across a river, and we had to figure out how to make it strong enough to hold giant trucks. As he spun the tale, simplifying engineering concepts for a child's understanding, he was acutely aware of Clarissa, watching them from the other side of the bed. Her expression was complicated, gratitude mixed with something deeper, more personal. Hours passed. More tests were run. Connor drifted in and out of sleep. Colton called Mrs. Rodriguez to check on Jason, who was apparently having the time of his life being spoiled with homemade cookies and Spanish lessons. Evening shadows lengthened across the hospital room. The doctors came with updates. No structural heart issues, found likely a one-time episode, more tests tomorrow, but promising signs. Clarissa never left the room, never checked her phone, never mentioned the meeting she'd missed or the calls gone unanswered. Her entire world had narrowed to this room, this bed, this child. When Connor finally fell into a deeper sleep, monitors showing stable readings, she turned to Colton. "You should go home to Jason. You've been here all day." "Mrs. Rodriguez can keep him overnight. She's done it before." He studied her face, the fatigue evident in the shadows beneath her eyes. "Unless you want me to go." "No," she admitted quietly. "I don't." They sat in companionable silence for a while, the only sounds the gentle beeping of monitors and Connor's steady breathing. "I was never meant to be a mother," Clarissa said suddenly, her voice barely above a whisper. "I never planned for it." Colton waited, sensing she needed to speak more than she needed a response. "Connor's father was a brief relationship. When I found out I was pregnant, he made it clear he wasn't interested in fatherhood." Her fingers gently stroked Connor's arm, careful not to disturb the IV. "Everyone advised me to take care of it, focus on my career, but I couldn't." She looked up, meeting Colton's eyes across the hospital bed. "I don't regret having him, not for a second, but I've spent every day since wondering if I'm doing it wrong, if he deserves better than what I can give him." "He has you," Colton said simply. "That's already better than many children get. But is it enough?" The question seemed torn from somewhere deep inside her. Today, when they called it from the school, all I could think was, what if I lose him? What if he's taken from me before I've figured out how to be what he needs? The vulnerability in her voice, the raw fear, it resonated with Colton's own experience, his own doubts after Leia died. "We never figure it out completely," he said gently. "We just keep trying, keep showing up, keep loving them the best way we know how." Is that enough? It has to be. He reached across the bed, careful not to disturb Connor, and took her hand. "Because it's all any of us have to give." Her fingers tightened around his, accepting the comfort, the connection. In that moment, with their hands linked across a sleeping child, something fundamental shifted between them. No longer CEO and consultant, no longer employer and employee, but simply two parents united by love for their children and the shared experience of facing life's most profound fears together. "Thank you for coming today," she whispered. "For staying." "Always," he replied, the word a promise he hadn't planned to make, but meant with every fiber of his being. Neither noticed the doctor observing them briefly from the doorway before quietly moving on, making a note in the chart about the patient's supportive family environment. Some truths are visible even to strangers. Morning arrived with the gentle persistence of hospital routines, the soft beeping of monitors, the hushed voices of changing shifts, the antiseptic smell that never quite faded. Colton woke with a stiff neck, his large frame awkwardly folded into the visitor's chair he'd occupied through the night. Across from him, Clarissa was already awake, her fingers gently stroking Connor's hair as the boy slept peacefully. She looked different in the pale dawn light filtering through the hospital blinds, softer, more vulnerable without her usual armor of designer clothes and corporate authority. Her blonde hair fell in loose waves around her face, her makeup long since faded. She wore the same clothes from yesterday, now wrinkled from the long night's vigil. Colton had never seen her more beautiful. Their eyes met across the hospital bed, a silent acknowledgement passing between them. They had crossed some invisible threshold during the night, moving from cautious allies to something deeper. Something neither was ready to name but both recognized. "Any changes?" Colton asked, his voice low to avoid waking Connor. Clarissa shook her head. "The night nurse said he's stable. Heart rate normal. They'll run more tests this morning." Her fingers continued their gentle rhythm through Connor's dark curls. Did you sleep at all? Some. He stretched his back, protesting the night in the chair. You don't. Not really. Her gaze returned to her son. I kept watching the monitors, as if my vigilance could somehow keep the numbers where they should be. Colton understood that feeling all too well. The irrational but overwhelming belief that if you just watched closely enough, cared deeply enough, you could protect those you loved from harm. He'd spent countless nights after Leia's death, staring at Jason's crib, counting breaths, terrified that if he closed his eyes even for a moment, his son might slip away too. I should check on Jason, he said, pulling out his phone. And you should eat something. I can go find coffee, maybe some breakfast. Before Clarissa could respond, the door opened and Dr. Mara entered, the pediatric cardiologist who had examined Connor the previous evening. She was a small woman with intelligent eyes and a calm demeanor that instantly commanded respect. Good morning, she said, taking in the two adults with an observant glance. I see you both stayed the night. How is he? Clarissa asked immediately, straightening in her chair. Dr. Mara consulted the tablet in her hands. The overnight readings are encouraging. His heart rhythm has remained stable and the EEG shows normal brain activity. She looked up. I believe what Connor experienced was indeed a vasovagal syncope. Essentially, his body overreacted to some trigger, causing his blood pressure and heart rate to drop suddenly. What kind of trigger? Colton asked. It varies. Sometimes emotional stress, sometimes physical, dehydration, hunger, even standing too long in one position. Dermera moved to Connor's bedside, checking the monitors with practiced efficiency. Has Connor been under any unusual stress recently? Changes at home, at school? Clarissa glanced at Colton, then back to the doctor. There have been some adjustments in our routine. New people in our lives. Her hand moved unconsciously toward Colton, then stopped, returning to the bed rail. But positive ones, I thought. Dr. Mara nodded. Children are more sensitive to change than we sometimes realize. Even good changes can create stress responses. She made a note in the chart. I'd like to run one more series of tests this morning, but if everything continues to look stable, Connor should be able to go home this afternoon. He'll be all right. Clarissa's voice held the barest tremor. I believe so. These episodes often resolve without further complications, especially in otherwise healthy children. Dr. Mara's expression softened slightly. Though I would recommend follow-up appointments and perhaps some lifestyle adjustments to minimize triggers. After the doctor left, Clarissa let out a long, shaky breath, the first real sign of the tension she'd been holding. Colton moved around the bed, standing beside her chair. He's going to be fine, he said softly, placing a hand on her shoulder. She looked up at him, in her blue eyes bright with the unshed tears. I've never been so scared, she whispered. Not even when the company almost went bankrupt during the recession. Not even when my father died and left me in charge of everything. Her voice caught. I realized I could lose all of that. The company, the money, everything, and still survive. But Connor. I know. Colton said simply because he did. The terrifying vulnerability of loving a child was universal. The knowledge that your heart now lived outside your body, exposed to all the dangers of the world. Connor stirred, then his eyes fluttering open. He looked confused for a moment, taking in the hospital room, then spotted Colton and smiled sleepily. You stayed, he said, the simple observation filled with childish wonder. Of course I stayed, buddy, Colton replied, moving to the edge of the bed. Somebody had to keep an eye on those machines and make sure they were working right. Connor giggled softly, then turned to his mother. Mommy stayed too. I'll always stay with you, sweetheart, Clarissa said, leaning forward to kiss his forehead. No matter what. Connor seemed to consider this, his small face serious. Can we go home now? Soon, Clarissa promised. The doctors need to do a few more checks first. And then ice cream, Connor asked hopefully. Clarissa laughed, a genuine sound of relief and joy that transformed her face. Yes, then ice cream. Colton watched them together, this mother and son, who had somehow become entwined with his own life in ways he never could have predicted. The sight created an ache in his chest, not the sharp pain of grief that had been his constant companion for so long, but something different, something that felt dangerously like hope. The East Los Angeles Community Housing Project was completed 2 weeks ahead of schedule. The ribbon-cutting ceremony was scheduled for a Saturday morning, a strategic choice to allow community members to attend. Colton stood at the edge of the gathering crowd watching as families explored the newly finished spaces, children already claiming the playground he had designed with such care. Jason and Connor raced across the central courtyard, weaving between adults, their laughter carrying on the warm air. The boys had become inseparable since Connor's release from the hospital, a development that both simplified and complicated the evolving relationship between their parents. Nervous, Clarissa asked, appearing beside him. She wore a simple blue dress rather than her usual business attire, a concession to the community focus of the event. Not nervous, Colton replied, just remembering. She followed his gaze to where a young couple stood beneath one of the courtyard trees, the woman heavily pregnant, the man with his arm protectively around her shoulders. They were studying a posted map of the complex, pointing out features to each other with evident excitement. "You're thinking about Leia," Clarissa said softly. Not a question. Colton nodded. She would have loved this place, the gardens especially. He smiled faintly. She always said buildings should grow food, not just contain it. Clarissa was quiet for a moment, then said, "Tell me about her, if you want to." The request surprised him. Few people asked about Leia anymore, as if mentioning her might somehow cause him pain, when in fact the silence around her name was often more painful than remembering. "She was a teacher," he began slowly. "Fifth grade. Believed education could change the world, but only if children felt safe and valued first." He looked out over the community spaces, seeing them through Leia's eyes. "She challenged me to design spaces that nurtured people, not just housed them. Said architecture was really just applied psychology, creating environments that shaped how people felt and behaved." "She sounds remarkable," Clarissa said. "She was." Colton turned to look at her directly. "She would have liked you." Clarissa raised an eyebrow. "Really, I'm everything she wasn't. Corporate, driven by profit margins, structured." "No," he shook his head. "You're a woman who chose to have a child alone rather than compromise your integrity, who built a company based on her father's principles rather than selling out, who stood in the rain to save a housing project when she could have made a phone call from her office." His voice softened. "Who sat all night in a hospital room watching her son breathe. Leia would have recognized what drives you beneath all the corporate armor." Clarissa looked away, clearly affected by his words, but unwilling to show it in such a public setting. Before she could respond, Chloe approached, tablet in hand. "They're ready for the speeches, Clarissa. The mayor just arrived." With a small nod to Colton, Clarissa moved toward the podium that had been set up near the community center entrance. Colton watched her go, noting how she straightened her shoulders, lifted her chin, transforming before his eyes into the CEO the public expected to see. The ceremony proceeded with practiced efficiency. The mayor spoke about urban renewal, a community representative expressed gratitude, and then Clarissa stepped to the microphone. She thanked the expected parties, the construction team, the city officials, her board of directors. Then she paused, her gaze finding Colton in the crowd. "But the true vision behind this project belongs to someone who reminded us that buildings are more than structures. They're frameworks for lives. Someone who showed us that good design isn't about showcasing wealth or status, but about creating spaces where people can thrive." Murmurs rippled through the corporate contingents as Clarissa continued. Colton Hayes brought more than architectural expertise to this project. He brought humanity, understanding, the lived experience of someone who knows that a home is built not just with concrete and steel, but with consideration and care. She gestured toward him. "Would you join me, Mr. Hayes?" Colton hesitated and uncomfortable with the public recognition. He hadn't done this for acclaim, but the expectant faces turned toward him, and he found himself moving forward, mounting the steps to the podium. Clarissa stepped aside, offering him the microphone. He took it reluctantly, surveying the gathered crowd. Corporate executives in expensive suits, construction workers who had implemented his designs, families who would live in the spaces he had imagined. "I'm not one for speeches," he began simply. "I believe buildings should speak for themselves. This one I am," he gestured to the complex behind him. "This one says that everyone deserves beauty in their lives, that shared spaces can create community, that children need room to grow and play, that gardens feed more than just bodies." He paused, searching for the right words. My late wife used to say that we shape our buildings, and afterward they shape us. My hope is that this place shapes joy, connection, and dignity for everyone who lives here. The applause was genuine, not the polite corporate acknowledgement he had expected, but something warmer, especially from the community members who would call this place home. As he stepped back, Clarissa leaned close to her voice for his ears only. That wasn't in the program, but it should have been. The official ribbon was cut, photographs taken, and then the formal part of the event dissolved into a community celebration. Food trucks arrived, music played, and the new residents began the process of claiming the space as their own. Colton found himself approached by several board members, all suddenly interested in his vision for future projects. He deflected politely, uncomfortable with the attention. He hadn't built this to advance a career he'd deliberately left behind. He was relieved when Jason and Connor found him clamoring for food and exploration. The boys provided the perfect excuse to step away from the corporate networking and into the more genuine interactions happening throughout the complex. They spent the next hour exploring every corner of the project, the boys racing ahead, discovering secret nooks and play spaces Colton had incorporated specifically for children. He explained certain features to curious new residents: the rainwater collection system for the gardens, the passive cooling design that would reduce electricity costs, the flexible community spaces that could adapt to changing needs. It was while showing a young mother how the playground equipment had been designed to accommodate children of different abilities that Colton realized Clarissa was watching him. She stood at the edge of the gathering, having exchanged her CEO persona for something more relaxed. There was a softness in her expression he rarely saw, a genuine pleasure in observing him in his element. When their eyes met across the playground, something passed between them, an acknowledgement of the journey that had brought them here, so different from where they had begun. Later, as the celebration wound down, they found themselves standing in the central courtyard. The sun was beginning to set, casting long shadows across the curved walkways and newly planted gardens. The boys had collapsed on a nearby bench, exhausted from hours of exploration and play. "What now?" Clarissa asked quietly. The question held layers of meaning beyond the immediate moment. Colton considered it carefully, looking out over the project they had built together. "I don't know," he admitted. "I didn't plan for after." She nodded, understanding. "Neither did I." They stood in companionable silence, watching as residents began moving personal belongings into their new homes, the first steps in transforming the spaces from theoretical to lived in. "The board was impressed with your work," Clarissa said finally. "Several members approached me about offering you a permanent position." Colton tensed slightly. They had been here before, her world reaching for him, pulling him back toward a life he had deliberately left. "I told them you weren't available," she continued, surprising him. "That you had other priorities." He turned to look at her. "You did." She met his gaze steadily. "I'm learning to see people as they are, not as I think they should be. You've made it clear that returning to corporate architecture isn't what you want." "Thank you," he said simply. "But she added, I did tell them you might consider selective consultations, special projects, on your terms." He smiled slightly. "Negotiating on my behalf now." "Advocating," she corrected. "There's a difference." The distinction wasn't lost on him. It echoed his own words about common spaces versus community spaces. Clarissa Dane was learning his language, just as he had been learning hers. "I might consider it," he acknowledged, "for the right projects." She nodded, satisfied with this small victory. "Good." Connor appeared then, tugging at Clarissa's hand. "Mommy, can Colton and Jason come for dinner, please?" Clarissa looked to Colton, a question in her eyes. "Actually," Colton said, crouching to Connor's level, "I was thinking maybe we could try something different tonight." "What?" the boy asked, immediately intrigued. "How about you and your mom come to our house? I could make my famous spaghetti and meatballs, and you and Jason could finish building that fort you started last time." Connor's eyes widened. "The blanket castle. That's the one." The boy turned to his mother, bouncing with excitement. "Can we, Mommy, please?" Clarissa smiled, a genuine, unguarded expression that transformed her face. "I'd like that," she said, her eyes meeting Colton's over Connor's head. "I'd like that very much." The blanket fort expanded to take over most of Colton's modest living room, the boy's architectural ambitions growing with each added sheet and cushion. Their delighted giggles drifted from beneath the fabric canopy as they created their own world complete with elaborate rules and imaginary dangers. In the kitchen, Colton moved with practiced ease, stirring the sauce that had been simmering for hours. The rich aroma of tomatoes, herbs, and slow-cooked meat filled the small house, creating an atmosphere of comfort and anticipation. Clarissa sat at the kitchen counter, wine glass in hand, watching him work. She had changed from her event dress into clothes Chloe had brought to her. Simple jeans and a soft sweater that made her look younger, more approachable. "You're good at this," she observed. "The domestic side of things." Colton glanced up from the stove. "Necessity. After Laya died, I had to learn. Jason couldn't live on takeout and frozen meals. I relied on meal services and our housekeeper," Clarissa admitted. "I can barely make toast without setting off the smoke alarm." He smiled. "Some skills are more important than others. I doubt I could run a multinational corporation." "You'd be surprised," she said, sipping her wine. "It's mostly about recognizing patterns and solving problems before they become crises. Not unlike engineering, I imagine. Or parenting," he added, "especially parenting." She set down her glass, watching him test the pasta. "Though I feel like I'm still learning that particular skill set." "We all are," Colton assured her. "There's no blueprint for raising children. You just build as you go, making adjustments when something doesn't work." The metaphor wasn't lost on her. "Is that your approach to everything? See what works, adjust what doesn't?" He considered the question as he drained the pasta. "I suppose it is. Plans are important, but they have to be flexible. Reality rarely matches the drawing." "My father used to say something similar about business strategies," Clarissa mused. "He called it responsive development, having a clear vision but being willing to adapt the implementation." Colton nodded, adding the pasta to his sauce. "Smart man." He was. There was a note of old grief in her voice. "Though I didn't always appreciate his wisdom when he was alive." "That's usually how it works," Colton said gently. "We don't recognize the value of what we have until later." Their eyes met across the kitchen, both aware that they were no longer talking about Clarissa's father. The moment was interrupted by Connor's head popping out from beneath the blanket fort. "Is dinner ready?" "We're starving in our kingdom," Colton laughed. "Almost ready, Your Majesty." "Perhaps you and your royal advisor could set the table." The boys emerged from their fabric castle giggling as they took on the task of distributing forks and napkins with more enthusiasm than precision. Dinner was served not at the small kitchen table, but picnic style on a blanket in the living room, a concession to the boys' insistence that they eat in the royal court. The adults sat cross-legged on the floor, balancing plates on their laps, while the children recounted elaborate tales of their imaginary adventures. And then, Connor explained, twirling spaghetti with more energy than skill. "The dragon tried to steal our treasure, but Jason scared him away with his sword." "Very brave," Clarissa replied, seriously wiping sauce from her son's chin. "What was the treasure?" Jason answered, his voice solemn with the weight of imagination. "It was a magic stone that makes people happy forever." "That sounds like a wonderful treasure," Colton said, exchanging a smile with Clarissa over the boys' heads. After dinner, as the evening grew later, the boys' energy finally began to wane. They curled up inside their fort with a tablet, watching a cartoon with heavy eyelids. Colton and Clarissa moved to the small back porch, taking their wine glasses with them. The night was cool, but not cold, the sky clear enough to see a few stars despite the city lights. They sat side by side on the steps, comfortable in each other's presence in a way that would have seemed impossible months ago. "Thank you for tonight," Clarissa said after a while. "Connor needed this. After the hospital," she trailed off. "Jason, too," Colton agreed. "He worries when routines change. Having Connor here helps." They sipped their wine in companionable silence, listening to the distant sounds of the city and the occasional giggle from the boys inside. "I've been thinking," Clarissa said finally, her voice careful, "about what the doctor said regarding Connor's episode, about stress and changes." Colton nodded, waiting for her to continue. "Our lives have become intertwined over these past months," she said. "The boys spend time together almost every day. You and I work together, eat together, make decisions together." She paused. "But there's no structure to it, no clarity, for the boys or for ourselves." He understood what she was saying. The undefined nature of their relationship had created a kind of limbo, comfortable in many ways, but ultimately unsustainable. "What are you suggesting?" he asked, keeping his voice neutral. Clarissa set down her wine glass, turning to face him directly. "I think we need to decide what this is, what we want it to be, for all of us." The question hung between them, the CEO and the maintenance man, the widow and the single mother, two people from different worlds who had somehow created a shared space. "What do you want it to be?" Colton asked quietly. Clarissa looked away, her profile etched against the night sky. "I want," she began, then stopped. When she continued, her voice was softer, more vulnerable than he had ever heard it. "I want my son to keep laughing. I want to come home to conversations instead of silence. I want to build something that matters more than quarterly reports and property values." She turned back to him, her eyes reflecting the porch light. "I want what we've started to become real, defined, intentional." The admission clearly cost her. Clarissa Dane, who negotiated billion-dollar deals without blinking, whose corporate armor was legendary, was offering something far more valuable than any business proposition. Colton felt the weight of the moment, the potential futures branching from this single conversation. He thought of Leia, not with grief, but with gratitude for the love they had shared and the lessons it had taught him. He thought of Jason, who deserved a chance at a complete family. He thought of Connor, whose she had somehow helped heal wounds he had believed permanent. And he thought of Clarissa, the woman beneath the CEO who had stood in the rain to save their project, who had sat all night watching her son breathe, who was now brave enough to ask for what she wanted. "I want that too," he said simply. Her exhale was audible, relief mingled with something like joy. "Really?" he smiled. "Really?" There was more to discuss, practical matters of how and when and where. But for now, in the quiet of the evening with their children drifting to sleep, inside the acknowledgement was enough. A foundation laid upon which something stronger could be built. Clarissa's hand found his on the step between them, her fingers twining with his. The contact was simple but profound, a connection freely chosen, not demanded or assumed. They sat together as the night deepened, not needing words to communicate what they both now understood. Some structures revealed their strength not in how they were designed, but in how they withstood the tests of time and circumstance. The proposal came 3 weeks later, but not in the way either of them expected. Colton and Jason had been spending more time at the Dane estate, a practical arrangement given the boys' friendship and the adults' increasingly intertwined lives. The four of them had settled into a comfortable routine. Dinners together most evenings, weekend outings, quiet moments of shared domesticity that had once seemed impossible. On this particular Sunday, Colton was in the expansive backyard, with the boys helping them build a treehouse in the massive oak that dominated the eastern corner of the property. Not an elaborate structure, but a simple platform with safety rails and a rope ladder. A project designed to teach the boy basic construction skills while creating a space that was uniquely theirs. Clarissa watched from the patio, laptop open but largely ignored in favor of observing the activity beneath the tree. Connor was handing tools to Colton with exaggerated care, his small face serious with the responsibility. Jason was measuring a board, his tongue poking out in concentration as he marked the cutting line with Colton's guidance. The scene stirred something in Clarissa's chest, a warmth, a certainty, a recognition of what she truly wanted her life to be. Not just professionally successful, but personally fulfilled. Not just a provider for her son, but part of a family unit that supported and nurtured all of them. The boys came running to the patio an hour later, excited to show her their progress. Colton followed more slowly, wiping sawdust from his hands, a contentment in his expression that matched what she felt in her heart. "Mommy, look," Connor exclaimed. "We built the floor, and next is the rails so we don't fall." "Very impressive," Clarissa said, genuinely admiring their work. "You're becoming quite the builders." "Colton says we can paint it when we're done," Jason added. "Any color we want." "That sounds wonderful," she replied. "Why don't you both get some lemonade from the kitchen? Mrs. Garcia made a fresh batch this morning." As the boys raced off, Colton settled into the chair beside her. "They're good together," he observed, not for the first time. "They are," she agreed. Then, making a decision that had been forming for weeks, she added, "So are we." He turned to look at her, something cautious but hopeful in his expression. "Yes, we are." Clarissa closed her laptop decisively. "I want to ask you something, Colton. Something important." Before she could continue, the boys burst back onto the patio, glasses of lemonade in hand, excitement radiating from them. "We had the best idea," Connor announced, his words tumbling out in a rush. "The most perfect idea ever." "What's that, buddy?" Colton asked, amused by their enthusiasm. It was Jason who answered, his voice earnest and hopeful. "We should all live together all the time. Not just sometimes." Connor nodded vigorously. "Yeah, like a real family. We could live here and you and Jason would never have to go home to your little house, and we could build things every day." The adults exchanged glances. Surprise mingled with something deeper, more significant. The very conversation they had been circling had just been thrust into the open by their children with the uncomplicated directness only children could manage. "That's," Colton began, clearly searching for the right response. "A wonderful idea." Clarissa finished, her eyes never leaving his. "One that I was just about to suggest myself." Colton's eyebrows rose slightly. "You were, she nodded, suddenly certain. "Not exactly in those terms, but yes." She turned to the boys. "But this would be a big change. Something we'd all need to be sure about." "I'm sure," Connor declared immediately. 1,000,000% sure." "Me too," Jason added. "Please, Dad. Please, can we?" Colton held Clarissa's gaze, 1,000 unspoken questions in his eyes. But beneath the questions was something steadier, a recognition of the path they had been on since that first day with the garden hose and plastic tub. "It's not that simple, guys," he said gently to the boys. "There are lots of things to figure out. But," he added, his voice softening, "it's definitely something to think about." The boys exchanged triumphant glances, clearly interpreting his cautious response as agreement. They gulped their lemonade and raced back to the treehouse, already planning where Jason's toys would go in Connor's room. Left alone again, Clarissa and Colton sat in a silence laden with possibility. "Were you really about to suggest that?" he asked finally. "Not in exactly those terms," she admitted. "But yes, I was going to ask if you would consider a more permanent arrangement between us." The corporate phrasing made him smile slightly. "A merger. A partnership," she corrected, allowing herself to smile in return. "One based on mutual respect, shared values, and—" She hesitated, then added softly, "growing affection." Colton reached across the table, taking her hand in his. His palm was rough from the morning's work, warm and solid against her skin. "I would need to maintain my independence," he said carefully. "Not financially, I know that's not an issue for you, but in terms of my work, my choices, I can't go back to corporate life even for you." "I wouldn't ask you to," she assured him. What I, what we need from you isn't your architectural credentials or business acumen. It's your perspective, your steadiness, your way of building not just structures, but connections." He nodded slowly, understanding what she was offering. Not a return to his old life, but the creation of something new. Something that honored who he had become, not just who he had been. "I'd want to keep my house," he said. "At least for now. As a workshop, maybe. A place to go when I need space." "Of course," she agreed immediately. "I know how important that is to you." They were negotiating in their way, establishing boundaries, clarifying expectations. But beneath the practical considerations was a current of something deeper, more profound than either had expected to find again. "The boys would need time to adjust," Colton continued. "Even though it was their idea, the reality would be different from what they imagined." "We could take it slowly," Clarissa suggested. "Maybe start with weekends, then gradually increase. See how it works for all of us." He squeezed her hand gently. "You've thought about this." "I have," she admitted. "More than I realized until just now." Colton was quiet for a moment, his gaze drifting to the treehouse where the boys were happily hammering, their childish voices carrying across the yard. "I never expected this," he said finally. "After Leia, I thought that part of my life was finished, that Jason and I would build our own small world, and that would be enough." "And now," Clarissa asked softly. He turned back to her, his expression open, vulnerable, in a way few people ever saw. "Now I'm beginning to think there might be room for more, for something I never planned but find myself wanting anyway." It wasn't a definitive yes, but it was more than Clarissa had dared to hope for, an acknowledgement of possibility, of willingness to try. "So we'll take it slowly," she said, "one step at a time. See what works, adjust what doesn't." He smiled, recognizing his own philosophy reflected back at him. Like building a house. Exactly, she agreed, starting with the foundation. Their hands remained linked across the table, a bridge between their separate lives, a promise of something being constructed between them. Not with blueprints or formal plans, but with care and attention to the small details that made a structure into a home. In the oak tree, the boys continued their work, unaware that their simple suggestion had crystallized something their parents had been moving toward all along. Their laughter drifted across the yard, the sound of childhood, of possibility, of futures not yet drawn, but full of potential. The integration happened gradually as they had agreed. Weekends first, then the occasional weeknight. Colton and Jason bringing select belongings to the Dane estate, favorite books, essential toys, the handmade quilt from Jason's grandmother that had to be on his bed no matter where he slept. There were adjustments, of course, moments of friction as four distinct individuals learned to share space and time. Connor struggled with sharing his mother's attention. Jason had nightmares the first few nights in the new environment. Colton found the estate's size overwhelming at times, retreating to his workshop, the converted pool house that Clarissa had designated as his space alone. And Clarissa herself faced perhaps the greatest challenge, learning to let go of control to allow messiness and spontaneity into her meticulously ordered world. The first time Colton cooked in her kitchen, leaving flour on the counters and pots soaking in the sink, she had to physically leave the room to keep from immediately cleaning up after him. But there were beautiful moments too. Connor running to Colton with a scraped knee, trusting him to make it better. Jason asking Clarissa to read his bedtime story, his small body cuddled against her side, as if he'd always belonged there. The four of them eating breakfast together on Sunday mornings, pancakes shaped like dinosaurs, and Pirate's maple syrup sticky on little fingers, and sometimes adult ones too. And later, after the boys were asleep, there were quiet conversations on the patio, glasses of wine, tentative touches that grew more confident with time. The slow, careful building of an adult relationship alongside the family one, neither rushed nor taken for granted, but nurtured with the patience of people who understood the value of what they were creating. 3 months into this careful merger of lives, Colton received an unexpected call. The Seattle architecture firm he had once worked for, Montrose and Klein, wanted him to consult on a major project. A community center for families affected by domestic violence designed to provide both safety and healing. They had seen the East LA housing development in a national publication and recognized his influence immediately. "They want me on site for the initial planning phase," Colton explained to Clarissa that evening after the boys were asleep. 2 weeks in Seattle. She nodded, absorbing the information. "It sounds like an important project." "It is." He ran a hand through his hair, a gesture she had come to recognize as a sign of internal conflict. "The kind of work I always wanted to do before life intervened," she finished for him. "You should go." He looked at her, surprised by her immediate support. "It would mean leaving you and the boys for 2 weeks." "We'll manage," she said firmly. "This matters to you, and it matters to the families who will use that center." She reached for his hand across the couch. "You've supported my work from the beginning. Did you think I wouldn't do the same for you?" The relief in his expression was palpable. Another small fear laid to rest, another piece of trust established between them. "I'll need to bring Jason," he said. "It's too long to be apart from him." "Of course," she agreed, "though Connor will miss him terribly." Colton hesitated, then suggested, "You could both come too, not for the whole time. I know you have the company to run. But maybe for a weekend I could show you and Connor the city some of my old projects." The invitation represented something significant. Colton opening a door to his past, inviting her into the world he had left behind, sharing not just his present and future, but his history as well. "We'd like that," she said simply. 2 days before their planned trip to Seattle, Clarissa found herself alone in her home office, reviewing quarterly reports with half her attention. The other half was focused on the changes occurring throughout her home, the evidence of Colton and Jason's presence visible in every room. Jason's drawings magnetized to the refrigerator alongside Connor's. Colton's books on the living room shelves, engineering texts mingling with her business volumes. Work boots by the back door sized for both man and boy. A blue toothbrush in her bathroom used on the mornings when Colton stayed there rather than in the guest room, they still maintained for appearance's sake, though its use had become increasingly rare. These small signs of integration should have bothered her. Clarissa Dane, who had built her life on order and control. Instead, she found them reassuring, even beautiful, in their representation of the family they were becoming. A knock at her office door interrupted her thoughts. Colton stood there, something in his hands. "Got a minute?" he asked. "Of course." She set aside the reports, giving him her full attention. He crossed to her desk, placing a rolled paper before her. "I wanted to show you something before we leave for Seattle." Clarissa unrolled the paper carefully, revealing a blueprint. Hand-drawn rather than computer-generated, the lines precise but somehow more personal than digital renderings. It took her a moment to recognize what she was seeing. A house. Not enormous like her current estate, but substantial. Modern in its aesthetics, but warm in its design, with curved elements reminiscent of the community spaces in their joint project. "It's beautiful," she said, studying the details. "One of your earlier designs?" "No," Colton said quietly. "Something new, something I've been working on at night when I couldn't sleep." She looked up at him, understanding dawning. "This is for us," he nodded, an uncharacteristic nervousness in his expression. "A possibility, not to replace your home if you don't want to, but a place that would be ours from the beginning. Designed for all four of us." Clarissa looked back at the blueprint, seeing it with new eyes. The large kitchen with space for family cooking. The boys' rooms connected by a shared play area. The studio workspace that would clearly be Colton's domain. The home office positioned to catch the morning light exactly as she preferred. "You've incorporated elements from both our lives," she observed, tracing a finger along the wraparound porch that echoed his bungalow's modest version. "That's the idea," he said, not erasing what came before, but building something new that honors both. She continued examining the plans, noting how every space flowed naturally into the next, how the design balanced privacy with connection, individual needs with family togetherness. "When did you start this?" she asked. "After Connor's hospital stay," he admitted. "It helped me process everything I was feeling. About him, about you, about what I wanted our future to look like." The admission touched her deeply. While she had been cautiously considering their relationship in practical terms, Colton had been expressing his hopes through the medium he understood best: design, creation, building. "It's just an idea," he added quickly, "not a pressure or expectation. We can stay here as long as you want. Forever, if that's what works best for everyone." Clarissa stood, moving around the desk to stand beside him. She took his hand, guiding it to the blueprint. "Show me," she said softly. "Show me what you were thinking when you designed each part." For the next hour, they stood together over the drawing, Colton explaining his choices. The way the boys' rooms could adapt as they grew older, the outdoor spaces designed for both play and quiet reflection, the sustainable elements incorporated throughout. As he spoke, Clarissa watched his face more than the blueprint. The animation in his eyes, the confidence in his gestures as he described structural choices, the occasional vulnerability when he mentioned a feature specifically designed with her preferences in mind. "This window seat in the master bedroom," he was saying, "would catch the afternoon light. I noticed you like to read then when you can find the time." She had never told him this. He had simply observed, remembered, incorporated. When he finished, Clarissa looked at the blueprint once more, no longer seeing just lines on paper, but the physical manifestation of what Colton hoped they could build together. Not just a house, but a vision for their shared future. "When we get back from Seattle," she said, her decision made, "let's talk to a contractor, see what it would take to make this real." The surprise and joy that crossed his face was worth any uncertainty she might have felt. Colton Hayes, who designed spaces for others to live their best lives, had finally allowed himself to imagine his own. He pulled her close, his arms strong and certain around her. "Are you sure?" She nodded against his chest, feeling the steady beat of his heart. "I'm sure it's time we built something that's truly ours. All of us." They stood together in the office that would eventually be emptied, in the house that would eventually be sold, holding the blueprint for a future neither had planned but both now embraced wholeheartedly. Outside, the boys' laughter drifted through the open window. Connor and Jason playing beneath the oak tree, unaware that their simple wish for a shared home was about to be granted in ways they couldn't yet imagine. The new house took 14 months to complete, longer than Clarissa's corporate efficiency preferred, but exactly as Colton had predicted. Quality couldn't be rushed, he reminded her when she grew impatient with delays. Some processes simply required their own time. The boys visited the construction site every weekend, watching with fascination as their future home took shape. Colton guided them through each phase, explaining foundations and framing electrical systems and insulation, turning the building process into an extended lesson in how things worked. Clarissa found herself increasingly involved as well, not just in selecting finishes and fixtures, but in understanding the structural decisions, the engineering choices, the careful balance of aesthetics and function. Colton taught her to read blueprints properly, to visualize three-dimensional spaces from two-dimensional drawings. She brought her business acumen to the project management, creating schedules and budgets that respected both financial realities and creative needs. It became in its way the most significant joint project of their evolving relationship, a physical manifestation of their commitment to building something lasting together. On moving day, exactly 2 years after their first encounter with a garden hose and plastic tub, the four of them stood in the driveway of their completed home. The modern structure rose before them, not imposing like Clarissa's former estate, not modest like Colton's bungalow, but something entirely new. Glass and wood merged with stone and steel curved elements, softening the clean lines gardens already planted around the perimeter. "Can we go in now?" Connor asked, bouncing with impatience. At 4 years old, he had grown taller, more articulate, but retained the essential joy that had first drawn Colton to him. "Not yet, buddy," Colton replied. "There's something important we need to do first." He crouched down, opening a small wooden box he had carried from the car. Inside were four shiny keys, each attached to a different colored tag. "Red for Connor," he said, handing the first key to the younger boy. "Blue for Jason." The second key went to his son, now a serious 6-year-old, who received it with appropriate gravity. "Green for Clarissa." The third key was placed in her palm, her fingers closing around it immediately. "And yellow for me." Colton finished, holding up the final key. "But why do we all need keys?" Jason asked practically. "Won't we be together most of the time?" "These aren't just for opening the door," Colton explained. "They're symbols. This house belongs to all of us equally. We all have a right to be here, to feel safe here, to call this place home." Clarissa felt her throat tighten at the simple ceremony, so characteristic of Colton's approach to life. No grand gestures, no elaborate statements, just meaningful action rooted in genuine values. "Now," Colton continued, "we're going to enter our new home together as a family." The boys didn't need to be told twice, racing up the front walkway with their keys clutched tightly in small fists. Clarissa and Colton followed more slowly, their hands finding each other with the easy familiarity of established connection. "Ready?" he asked quietly. She looked at him, this man who had entered her life as a maintenance worker and become so much more. Partner, co-parent, lover, friend. The unlikeliest of matches, yet somehow perfectly right. "Ready," she confirmed. Together they joined the boys at the front door, each inserting their key into one of the four locks Colton had specially installed for this moment. On the count of three, they turned their keys simultaneously, the door swinging open to reveal their new home, empty of furniture, but full of possibility. The boys rushed in immediately, their excited voices echoing through the open space as they claimed rooms and explored corners. Clarissa and Colton remained on the threshold a moment longer, taking in the reality of what they had built. Not just physically, but emotionally. "It's perfect," she said softly. Colton smiled, the expression lighting his entire face in a way that still made her heart skip. "Not perfect," he corrected gently, "but exactly right for us." He held out his hand and she took it without hesitation. Together they stepped across the threshold, closing the door behind them on the separate lives they had once led and moving forward into the home they had designed to share. Outside, the afternoon sun cast the shadow of their new house across the freshly planted garden. Strong, solid, built to last. Inside, the sound of children's laughter echoed through rooms designed to nurture connection, growth, and joy. Not a perfect home, but a true one. Built by an engineer who understood that the most important structures weren't made of concrete and steel, but of commitment, patience, and love.